Okay, so today we're going to be doing something very different. We're going to be making a prediction video about the 10th generation of consoles. That's right, you heard me right. I'm talking about the 10th generation, not the PlayStation 5, but the PlayStation 6. So we're talking like 6, 7, 8 years into the future. I predict that the PlayStation 6 will come out in the holiday 2027. I think we are going to have a pretty long console generation. This generation was pretty long, meaning the 8th generation. We had a pretty long generation considering how underpowered the PlayStation 4 was and the Xbox One. But we did have those in between consoles like the Xbox One X and the PlayStation 4 Pro. I do predict that we're not going to really see much of that again, but I do think Microsoft is going to make multiple versions of their ninth generation consoles. But I do think 2027 is when we will see the formal introduction of the new generation of consoles. So that will consist of the PlayStation 6, possibly a new Xbox, though it seems reasonably likely that Microsoft might be focusing away from the console manufacturing market and more towards the service market, the service industry, and focus more on their services like xCloud, like their PC services. So they might focus more on that, focus more on the cloud than they will actually focus on creating a video game console to directly compete with Sony. I mean, we're kind of seeing it in that direction in 2019, but I think that we're going to see more and more of that as time goes on. And I do think that there will also be another competitor because we're going to see a situation where Sony is going to completely dominate the entire competition in the ninth generation. I mean, Microsoft, with a lack of compelling exclusives, with so many different problems that Microsoft is having right now with their branding. I mean, the Xbox brand is not as strong as it used to be. So Sony might have a huge advantage in the ninth generation going into the 10th generation, where Microsoft is going to have a hard time having credible competition to Sony. So we might see the last Xbox console in the ninth generation, and we might not see a traditional console from Microsoft in the 10th generation. But I do think that there will definitely be a PlayStation 6. It will bundle with with their PlayStation VR system. I think that's going to happen. Now, they might do it where you might have an option to buy it or not to buy it, but I think Sony's going to really be pushing, like really push VR at that point to try to get people to adopt it more. And they're going to do that a lot in the ninth generation, but I feel like they're really going to push in the 10th generation. And by the time we reach 2027, which is the year I think this is going to come out, I think we'll reach a point where VR will be like an actual, like an enjoyable experience that the mainstream will easily adopt and will have no problem forking over the extra $100 or however much it will be to get the bundle. Or like if they do something similar to Microsoft with the Kinect with the Xbox One, it might actually work better in their favor because the VR might be something that is more exciting and that people might actually want to play more than the Kinect, which was just a forced thing that people had no interest in playing. So it might actually work out better than them. But I still think that Sony might offer an option to buy it bundled or not bundled. But I am kind of leaning more towards that it's going to be a forced bundle. Like if you want the PlayStation 6, it's going to be already integrated with VR, and you're going to have the VR system. As far as the specs go, I think we're going to have 10 terabytes of storage. I mean, right now, 2 terabytes, even the 2 terabyte hard drive that I bought for my PlayStation 4, that's not going to cut it for the 9th generation. So games are going to get even bigger in the 10th generation. I think 10 terabytes is going to be the minimum storage that you can have reasonably on a new console. So I think you're going to have that. You also could potentially have 8K 60 frames per second, or if we're not at 8K yet, because we did have HD for a long time, right? In the 7th generation, we first started seeing HD, and into the 8th generation, the new PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, when it came out in 2013, it wasn't 4K capable. So we might see a situation where the console manufacturers might stick with 4K and not want to move on to the next thing. But you do see a lot of television manufacturers and people who are involved in the electronics. They are pushing heavily towards 8K as of late, which is weird because people aren't adopting 4K, but they're making huge investments in 8K technology, that I think it might be reasonable to suspect that 8K might become a staple in gaming by the time we reach 2027 when the PlayStation 6 comes out. So I think we might have 8K 60 frames per second. If we don't have 8K 60, we will at the very minimum have 4K 120. It needs to have at least some type of upgrade from the PlayStation 5, so I think we're going to have that. We're going to have a 16-core CPU upgraded from the 8-core CPU of the PlayStation 5. 32 gigabytes of RAM, which would be the minimum. I mean, we might have more, but I think 32 gigabytes might be enough in 2026, because right now 16 gigabytes to run any modern PC games is more than adequate. So I think by then 32 gigabytes will be the standard, and it will be acceptable to have a new console with 32 gigabytes of RAM. And I think they're going to continue with that Navi-based AMD GPU. So with that, you're going to have backwards compatibility. You're going to have PlayStation 5 backwards compatibility, PlayStation 4 backwards compatibility, which will be guaranteed. I can't see that not happening. But as far as PlayStation 1, 2, and 3, it's still a little bit iffy. I mean, we still don't know at this point, as of the recording of this video, if the PlayStation 5 will have full backwards compatibility with the PlayStation 1, 2, and 3. I did make that prediction myself, so I don't know if that will actually come true, but I would think at that point that we would have some full backwards compatibility integration with the increased demand that we've seen for backwards compatibility in recent years. So we could potentially see that, though I'm less confident about that prediction, but it's very possible. But another thing, and this is going to be a kind of a negative prediction, I think Sony is going to get very cocky. Okay, we're going to see a lack of competition in the 9th generation. Sony's going to wipe the floor with the competition in the 9th generation to the point that Sony's going to start getting cocky like they did in 2006 when they launched the PlayStation 3. $599 US, no games, all these different problems that the PlayStation 3 had, because Sony was like, well, you know, we might have a lackluster console, but there's no other option for you to buy from us. So, like, you can't go to another competitor because we're really the only game in town. I mean, yeah, you had Microsoft, you had Nintendo, but Sony had a much larger market share than those two companies put together back then. So they felt confident that they could just half-ass the PS3 and things will be okay. I think similarly, the PlayStation 6 is going to have a disastrous launch, similar to the PlayStation 3. Now, whether or not that's going to be the actual price of the console, if it's going to be too expensive, like in relation to bundling the VR system together with the console, and people are going to be pissed off about that, or potentially, ironically, Sony could have some type of forced DRM implemented on their new console. They kind of shied away from that when they launched the PS3 because the consumers weren't ready for that, but they might make some type of financial decision, calculation in their head that might say, well, you know, people might actually be okay with this, or we can get away with it more than we did back in 2013 with Microsoft. So that might happen. There might be some always online 24-hour check-in, some type of situation, or maybe even like no disk drive, and there might still be people who are into discs. But I do predict by the time we reach 2027, GameStop will be completely out of business. Physical media will continue to decline. So they might actually get away with having a disc-free console if they decide to go ahead with that. And I do think it's very possible. I think they're going to be fully committed to physical media in the 9th generation, but as far as the 10th generation is concerned, I'm less confident about that. So that is the PlayStation 6. Now we're getting into Nintendo, which is actually going to be a lot sooner than what I've been talking about. So the PlayStation 6, I predict, is going to come out in 2027. I think Nintendo's next console will come out in 2022. So why 2022? Well, 5-6 years is the average time that Nintendo comes out with a new console. So think about 1985, the Nintendo Entertainment System came out. Then 1991, the Super Nintendo came out, so that's 6 years. Then 5 years later, in 1996, the Nintendo 64 came out. 5 years after that, the GameCube. 5 years after that, the Wii. And 6 years after that, the Wii U. And 5 years later, it was the Wii. It was the Nintendo Switch. So I think we're going to see something very similar to that, in that we're going to see 5 years after the release of the Switch, or possibly 6 years, so it could be 2023, but I don't think it could be any later than that. But I am putting my gut on 2022 because I think that is probably, I mean, maybe that's going to be the time we're going to hear about it, but I'm going to be fully committed. 2023 is going to be the official release date of the Nintendo Switch 2, because I think they're going to continue with this hybrid gimmick that they got going on, but the gimmick works really good. I think it has more longevity than the Wii with its motion control, so where the Wii U failed in trying to succeed the Wii, I think the Nintendo Switch 2, or whatever they decide to call it, will actually be a lot more successful than the Wii U was. So I think that's going to happen. So as far as the Nintendo Switch is concerned, the Nintendo Switch 2, I think that's also going to happen because they don't have to separate between their handheld and their console. So they had different development teams for the 3DS and for the Wii U. So I think having a more streamlined ecosystem for Nintendo is going to be beneficial to them, and that's why they're going to continue with that. Plus, the Switch is selling off the shelves. Even like 3 years after the console came out, as of the recording of this video, the Switch is selling off the shelves. And I think it's going to continue that way. I think the Switch easily has 3 more years out of it. And as far as improvements to the Switch, so I think you're going to have an upgraded Tegra chip, so it's going to be similar to the original Switch. It's going to be fully backwards compatible with Switch games. It's going to be 4K 60 capable while it's docked, but on screen it will only be 1080p capable. Better Joy-Cons, which is probably a given, but it's something that I would hope for. For example, better D-pad, better analog, better triggers. Make it so damn good that you will have no need to buy a Pro controller. That's what I predict will happen, but maybe it's me being overly optimistic, but I do think that's a reasonable prediction to make. What else about the Nintendo Switch 2? I think Nintendo's going to diversify their IPs, so you're going to have new IPs that you're going to see. So you're going to have a Mario title at launch, you're going to have a Zelda title at launch, which is the standard with Nintendo. But I do think you could potentially see the push towards M-rated, more mature IPs developed directly by Nintendo. I think Nintendo's actually going to start diversifying and try to appeal to a wider audience range. So I know Nintendo's been hesitant to head towards that direction over the years because they don't want to ruin their reputation, I guess you could say, and take away that reputation of them being family-friendly and kid-friendly. But I do think you could potentially see Nintendo expand and have more investment in more mature M-rated IPs. So that's a potential thing that could happen. I do also predict, and I think this is also a reasonable prediction, cross-party chat. Better online infrastructure. Nintendo's got to invest with their online infrastructure. There's no way they can get away with half-assing it in the next generation. There's no way they can do that. And also better virtual console support. Not this bullshit with their subscription service that nobody wants or cares about, where you get like 2 free NES games a month. These games that are like 30 years old and nobody cares about. No, I don't think that's going to happen. I predict and I hope that you are going to have a better integration with the full library of Nintendo games over the years. And that's going to be another instrumental thing in the growth of Nintendo with their next console to get people to actually want to buy the console. Oh, and as far as storage goes on the Switch, I predict they're going to do something very similar to what they did in the Wii U and on the Nintendo Switch, where they kind of cheap out on storage space. So the Wii U and the Nintendo Switch both came with only 32 gigabytes of storage, and if you wanted to reasonably play a good number of games and not have to delete everything every second, and there are even a lot of games that the original storage on the Switch was not enough to play even one game, in the case of NBA 2K and other games like that. So, yeah, if you reasonably want to play games on your Switch 2, you're going to have to buy a separate memory card with more storage, similar to the original Switch and with the Wii U. And battery life, that's another interesting thing to talk about. So currently, the new updated Switch has a battery life of about 5 to 8 hours, 5 to 9 hours, something around there. So I think you'll have slightly improved battery life. I would say about 7 to 10 hours. That would be the battery life that I would expect reasonably out of the new Switch. So that's what I predict is going to happen with the Switch 2. So Switch 2, 2023, that's my final prediction. Now, going back to Xbox, or should we say xCloud, Microsoft could potentially drop out of the home console market, but their presence in gaming will remain. I do think that their focus will be on cloud. I mean, Microsoft is one of the biggest innovators in tech with cloud technology and cloud computing. So potentially the xCloud could do a lot better than Stadia was, and I do predict that by the time these new consoles come out in the 10th generation, Stadia will be shut down. Streaming will grow, but it won't supersede the consoles. I don't think that we're going to be there at that point, and I'm skeptical as to when we'll ever be at that point, to be honest. So that's another thing talking about. Let's talk about streaming. So Microsoft will continue to be fully committed to their streaming platform, to the xCloud. I think that's going to be apparent. But are they going to focus more on the cloud and just gradually phase out their presence in the console market? Potentially. But I think what's going to end up happening is that there's going to be continued competition between Sony and Microsoft, but that competition will exist more in the realm of streaming. So Sony is going to continue pushing PlayStation Now, while Microsoft will continue pushing their xCloud, or whatever its formal name will become, because xCloud is just the project name. And I still don't even know what the name of Project Scarlet is as of the recording of this video. So I imagine if you're watching this in 2027 or 2026, whenever people start getting interested in the 10th generation, this video is going to be so outdated. But Project Scarlet and the PlayStation 5, I think that there will be competition between Microsoft and Sony a little bit in that hardware space. Sony's going to completely dominate, but there will be more competition between Sony and Microsoft in the streaming world than in the console world, if that makes sense. So Sony will completely dominate when it comes to consoles, even if Microsoft comes out with a new console in the 10th generation, unless they completely change the way that they do business, because no exclusives. If you got no exclusives, you got no relevant console. I'm sorry, but I mean that seems to be the case with the Xbox One. I imagine that's going to be the case with the Project Scarlet. So that's how I think things are going to go with streaming. But I do not think that streaming is going to completely supersede consoles, is going to overtake consoles as the most relevant gaming platform in the video game industry. I just do not think that we're going to be in that direction. And if we are going to be in that direction, it's not going to be for a very, very long time. But I also have another interesting prediction before I wrap this up. I think it's very plausible that a new competitor jumps into the console race. That it's very possible that we are going to have another company come in and compete with Sony and Nintendo, and to a lesser extent Microsoft, and that they are going to see that there's potentially going to be a power vacuum filled with Microsoft, because Sony's just going to completely dominate and Microsoft's going to shift away from consoles, right? So if that happens, I think it's very plausible, and with Nintendo kind of doing their own thing and not trying to directly compete with Sony and just doing their own thing. I mean, the Nintendo Switch isn't going to be able to compete with the PlayStation 5, so I imagine the Nintendo Switch 2 isn't going to be able to compete with the PlayStation 6. And when I mean compete, I don't mean by like actual hardware sales. I mean more of like third-party support with overall relevance, with having those innovations and being able to play the newest and latest games, because the Switch in 2019, 2020 is very underpowered. I mean, it is very underpowered. It is less powerful than the PlayStation 4, which came out in 2013. And of course, they had to make compromises because they're doing the whole hybrid thing. But it's gonna put them at a disadvantage if they wish to directly compete with Sony. So is it possible that maybe the Switch 2 could fail and then Nintendo's going to make a new console like 5 years later? in 2028 and directly compete with Sony? It's possible, but I still think Nintendo's just going to keep going with the Switch formula and not try to directly compete with Sony like they did back in the mid-90s. So I think it's going to head towards that direction. I think PC will start to see a short decline, a small decline. It's not going to decline drastically, but I do think that the console market will grow while the PC market will shrink slightly. And if we do hit a new recession, which is possible, and I'm just going crazy with my predictions. I'm talking about recession now. But if we do have a recession, I mean, that can completely change the trajectory, the trajectory of all my predictions, especially when it comes to PC, because in a recession, I mean, the PC market was doing really bad in the mid-2000s, in 2008, 2009, 2010, at the height of the recession, because people could not afford to get these expensive graphics cards. So if there's a recession, PC will decline while console will grow, and potentially the console generation, the 9th generation, could last longer if there is a recession, like we saw in the 7th generation, where we would have seen the new generation of consoles come much sooner if it weren't for the 2008 recession. So if there's another recession coming in the 2020s, then that could influence things as well. But overall, as far as who the winner is going to be, I think they're all going to do great in their own right. So if Microsoft decides to go away from consoles, they're still going to do great in what they do. I think they're going to create their own niche in the cloud world. I think in the PC market, they're going to do very well, especially if they continue with their trajectory with putting their games on PC, Halo and all that. I mean, those games have a huge PC community. So if they continue with that, I mean, they're definitely not going to go out of business. They're definitely going to continue. They're going to make a lot of money with their gaming IPs, but they're going to do good in their own right. I think the new Nintendo Switch, the Switch 2, could probably pull at least 80 million units if it's done right. I think the PlayStation 6 will probably sell around 90 million, 100 million units. And I think this other competitor, potentially to Sony, that's not Microsoft, but a brand new company, maybe like an Apple or Amazon, some type of big company that is familiar with hardware. So it's not going to just be some like random startup. But I think they will do well in their own right if they do exist, but I do not think they can overtake the PlayStation 6. They can overtake Sony in the 10th generation, because Sony will just have a huge advantage with third-party support, with the relationships that they have made with people in the video game industry, with the developers and with the publishers, that a new competitor would be at a huge disadvantage. And Nintendo would be at a slight disadvantage with the hardware disparities, though they will have their own audience, so that's not going to be as big of a deal. I think everyone's going to do well. I don't think Sony or Nintendo is going to go out of business or anything like that. And I do think that we will see an 11th generation of consoles, but we're not going to do that. We're not going to do that yet. That's definitely pushing it. But those are my overall predictions on the 10th generation of consoles. Let me know what you guys think. If you think I'm just nuts for talking about something that's going to happen like 8 years from now. But I figured it would be an interesting conversation. And of course, this isn't going to be the last video I make. This isn't going to be my full official predictions of the 10th generation, because time is a very important thing. I mean, 15 years ago, who could have predicted anything about what gaming would look like today? So yeah, it's very time relative, but I thought it'd be fun to have an early discussion and to look back on this a few years from now and see how much of it I got right, how much of it I got wrong. And I just thought it was a fun conversation to have. So let me know what you guys think. And if you enjoyed this Call of Duty gameplay, I recommend you check out my Call of Duty channel. Link is in the description. With that being said, thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you all later. Bye.